Hello learners, welcome to the 22nd lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century English novel as manifested in the work of a selected group of women novelists. So we have been discussing the life and the textual details of one novel, that is Nightwood by Djuna Barnes. This will be the last lecture in which I will discuss this text. As I mentioned earlier, I will not be able to do a complete commentary on the novel, but I hope I have been able to give you all a sense of what it feels like to be slightly disoriented, but all the same experience the sharpness and the sensitivity with which the narrator of this novel invites us to imagine the world it creates, and also through that to perceive the world in which we ourselves function. In this last lecture, I will go over very quickly some very general plot details, some key events in the chapters 2 and 3, and until the point where the novel has successfully introduced all of the characters that will play a major role. So we have encountered some of these characters already. That is to say, we've encountered the Baron, Felix, we've encountered the Doctor, and we have also encountered Robin Vogt. We will encounter two more characters in chapters 2 and 3, that is Nora and Jenny. And as soon as I have introduced these characters or talked you through how the narrator of Nightwood introduces these characters, I will stop, because after that you are free to read how the novel stages the various interactions between these characters. I will stop there and offer some general thoughts about modernism, about the place of Nightwood, and some ideas of why this text is called Nightwood and what we can make of it. So the point at which my commentary of Nightwood stopped in the previous lecture was when, after having married Robin, Felix takes her on this tour, which can be called European History 101 or European Culture 101. And as a male pseudo-aristocrat, someone with something of a claim to traditional European social influence, the Baron is a figure that is familiar to many historians and scholars of modernism. The phrase "mind of Europe" is a phrase that occurs in T.S. Eliot's early but iconic essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent. By the phrase "the mind of Europe," Eliot means that any cultural practitioner must first perform an act of self-sacrifice. That is, they must efface themselves, consume and internalize the culture of Europe, and then try to design their own writing. Eliot is writing about poets, but he also means other forms of cultural artists. They must think of positioning their work as a response to this history of cultural production in Europe. So that is T.S. Eliot. And we know that T.S. Eliot was one of the early champions of Nightwood. And it's tempting to think that T.S. Eliot might have smiled or chuckled at the representation of Felix, and especially the critique through Felix of this very masculine fantasy of internalizing and this dialogue between tradition and individual talent. Barnes's novel Nightwood evokes that idea of a dialogue between tradition and individual talent, invokes the possibility of it, but reveals that this can exist only as a dream, as a wish, as a fantasy. That in reality, such dialogues rarely exist, and what we do get in reality is not a dialogue, but a breakdown of communication. It's the domination or the domineering presence of the centuries of cultural history of Europe fails to excite new communication, new relationships. In fact, it produces alienation. So it's a critique of how certain individuals would want culture to function in their lives, and it's an invitation to explore other modes of living with culture. So, who is alienated from whom? Robin is the one who's alienated. And in fact, to be fair, the alienation begins from Felix. Felix himself realizes that what he's dragging Robin through, this forced cultural and historical education in the glories of Europe, is at best failed and at worst an abortive attempt. So he stops and he comes clean and he says what he wants, which is not really the cultural education of Robin, but rather the the exploitation or the use of Robin's body, her reproductive capacity, and says that he wants a child. And this leads to a kind of alienation, which I think is the first instance or the first clue as to why the novel is called Nightwood. There are many characters who walk at night. Robin is one of them. But there are other characters also who thrive, who come alive at night. And this activities, the sense of enervation that these characters experience at night is not simply a sign of their alienation from capitalist, modern, and heteronormative Europe, although that is the first condition of it. That is, it is not that people function in this night world only if they are alienated from capitalist Europe, but the alienation from capitalist Europe is, you could say, the ticket of entry into this night world. What happens in the night world has a lot more going on with it, has a lot more to do with than simply one's alienation from capitalist Europe. But this is the first instance in the novel that we get a sense of people estranged, sad, depressed, but also angry, and wandering and walking at night. Robin Vote is the first such character, and we see that she starts to walk, but she also does something else. She takes the Catholic vow and wanders the countryside to travel to other cities. But the key things are that she's alone and she's engrossed. And during this period of Robin walking alone, on her brief return home, Felix finds her and she happens to be reading a book. That book is the memoirs of Marquis de Sade, and the quote that Felix finds on the page that's open when he walks in on her, that is actually very telling. Before we actually get to that, we will read through this passage in which just before this very violent thing is about to take place, that is just before Robin Hood is about to give birth to a child, and as she is dragged through this marriage and pregnancy that she had very, very little consent in, she experiences something, and the narrator describes this experience. It's an intellectual, spiritual, and emotional experience. And this is how the narrator describes it. She, that is Robin, she tried to think of the consequences to which her son was to be born and dedicated. She thought of the Emperor Francis Joseph. There was something commensurate in the heavy body with the weight in her mind, where reason was inexact with lack of necessity. She wandered to thoughts of women that she had come to connect with women. Strangely enough, these were women in history: Louis de Valère, Catherine of Russia, Madame de Maintenon, Catherine de Medici, and two women out of literature, Anna Karenina and Catherine Heathcliff. And now there was this woman, Austria. She prayed, and her prayer was monstrous, because in it there was no margin left for damnation or forgiveness, for praise or for blame. Those who cannot conceive a bargain cannot be saved or damned. She could not offer herself up. She only told of herself in a preoccupation that was its own predicament. So a lot to unpack here, but I'll talk about a couple of things and then move on. The first thing to note is that as the child is about to be born, Robin is full of thoughts of her complicity in a world with which she is not in sympathy with. This is the first thought to note, and this is the first indication of the absolute cutoff and the absolute sense of alienation that Robin feels with regard to the world in which she exists. It's a strange sense of alienation because she has been dragged into a sense of complicity, because it is through her reproductive capacity that that very world with which she has so little in common and with which she sympathizes so little will be recreated, replicated. So it's a very overwhelming, and I can imagine something that would make for a feeling of extreme powerlessness. The response to this feeling of powerlessness is to think about women, and women that in Robin Wood's imagination are worth thinking about or worth knowing and worth recognizing because of their connection to other women. And she thinks about two kinds of women. There are about five or six women named, and they fall into two categories. The first category consists of women who are known as historical figures. They were real individuals who existed and whose names are known to us from books of history. There's another category of women who are not real in the sense that they are fictional characters. Anna Karenina is from Tolstoy's famous novel Anna Karenina, and Catherine Heathcliff is from Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. And this difference in the historical existence of these two women is not something that the narrator clarifies. And immediately after listing these women, the narrator tells us that Robin Wood prayed, and this was a monstrous prayer. So it's a monstrous prayer, and this has something to do with the fate of these fictional women, because both of these fictional women have tragic endings. Most obviously is the case of Anna Karenina, whose death is widely seen as a sort of betrayal by a male writer of a transgressive, powerful, independent woman character. And so it's actually very strange and in some ways quite ironic that Anna Karenina is a character that is invoked by the narrator of Nightwood as a fictional character with whom this character, Robin Wood, would like to initiate or enact an act of solidarity. This is one of the many creative connections that the narrator of Nightwood is aiming to spark in the imagination of its readers. And while the general contours of this solidarity are clear, that is, these are strong, independent, free-willed women characters, and Robin Wood thinks of them because she is similar to them. She's a woman who's independent, etc., etc. But if one scratches the surface, one finds that there's a great deal of difference in the kinds of autonomy that these two women fictional characters enact. So this is something for us to reflect as we think about Nightwood. The final thought about this is prayers involve an effacement of the self. Prayers involve a submission of the person praying in the presence of a higher authority. That is not the case here, and we are told very specifically that Robin Wood could not offer herself up. She only told of herself in a preoccupation that was its own predicament. And in a way, this is the story of the novel, or rather, this is the story of Djuna Barnes' writing of Nightwood. There are no solutions, there is no consolation. The novel is this kind of a monstrous prayer. It is alienated. The writer is alienated from the world in which she seems to be trapped without her will, without her consent. And so her only way of coping in this very entrapped situation is to offer up this kind of a monstrous prayer. Not to efface herself before the gods of heteronormative or capitalist European modernity, but rather to tell of herself and of others who are similarly marginalized through different means for their identities like her. We'll see that each of these women, that's Robin Vogt, Nora, and Jenny, they're all marginalized in different ways. They are individuals who find themselves trapped in conflicts, not because they chose the conflict, but because they were simply existing as who they were. And this is true of other characters as well. And so that gives us a clue as to why this novel is called Nightwood. It's about what happens at night. It's about how the night gives a realm of possibility to individuals for whom daytime concerns or daytime Europe did not give a space to coexist, to exist as they were. Now, Felix walks in on Robin, who's sleeping one night, having wandered for a few days, having done her night walking, and he finds a book lying open beside her. And the following line marked or highlighted. The original quote is in French. I will read loose English translation. And that sentence reads, gave to him during his captivity the 1,000 services that only love is capable of giving. This sentence is from the memoir of Marquis de Sade, which is also the writer who is the source of the expression sadism or sadomasochism, etc. Now, this quote and the fact that Felix finds this, and Felix finds Robin having fallen asleep, supposedly having read and underlined and thought a great deal about this very sentence, is actually very ironic because it lends itself to a wide range of interpretations. The sentence generally tries to make a connection between the values of captivity, but it's not actually straightforward. It seems to suggest that when someone is kept as a captive, right, then they would be in a situation where they would be best disposed to enact a kind of devotion. But it's not clear who is captive here in this case and who is giving this kind of devotion. So, on one hand, the straightforward interpretation would be that Robin reads this quote from Marquis de Sade and identifies with the captive who through her situation of captivity finds in herself unlocked this capacity for providing love. And so, in an ironic way, this quote seems to reinforce the very violent and dangerous way of thinking and philosophy of life, even, which Felix has been trying to produce. On the other hand, however, there are creative ways of reinterpreting this moment. It's quite possible, for instance, that the captivity that Felix produced and the captivity in which Felix trapped Robin was the condition that allowed Robin to discover something else about herself, to discover that she has the capacity of giving love. The key difference here is that the love that Robin feels unlocked and the capacity for which Robin finds unlocked in herself is not a love that's directed towards Felix, but towards someone or something else. And this is one of the many ways in which the opening pages and opening chapters of Nightwood are incredibly powerful. They're full of possibility. They're like raw neurons firing in all directions. And they simply trigger so many different connections in the minds and the imaginations of readers. Now, after the child is born, Robin becomes even more estranged, starts to wander again, and starts to travel even more, starts to disappear for days. Eventually, at some point, she starts to become completely estranged, and it is in this state of being estranged that she is found by Nora. The third chapter is titled Night Watch. This is the one that introduces Nora to us, and it also tells us that Nora lived in this strange house, which is called the strangest salon in America. It is an inherited house, which we are told remained in Nora's family for 200 years. The property had been in the same family 200 years, and now I'm reading from Djuna Barnes. It had its own burial ground and a decaying chapel in which stood in tens and tens mouldering psalm books laid down some 50 years gone in a flurry of forgiveness and absolution. Further, this house, which is the strangest salon, is described in these words. It was the pauper's salon for poets, radicals, beggars, artists, and people in love. For Catholics, Protestants, Brahmins, dabblers in black magic and medicine, all these could be seen sitting about her oak table before the huge fire, Nora listening, her hand on her hound, the firelight throwing her shadow and high against the wall. Of all that ranting, roaring crew, she alone stood out. The equilibrium of her nature, savage and refined, gave her bridled skull a look of compassion. She was broad and tall, and though her skin was the skin of a child, there could be seen something early in her life, the design that was to be the weather-beaten grain of her face, that wood in the work, the tree coming forward in her, an undocumented record of time. So we can see this, how the author moves from a description of the house to a description of alienation, to the description of the communities of individuals, long list of groups of human beings who were not really given a space at the head of the table in 19th century America. And from this sociological list of people who were excluded, we conclude in this magical, surreal description of the texture of the skin on Nora's face. And this is not simply the description of a person's face, although it is, but it again connects human beings to the inanimate but very much alive world of nature around them. In fact, it is almost insulting to use the word nature to describe the way trees, flower, and animals are described in this novel. The word nature almost seems like a condescending word, whereas the treatment, in fact, that we find in Nightwood is a treatment that assumes that this world of inanimate or so-called inanimate is only inanimate because we have certain blinkers with which we human beings tend to perceive nature. And if those blinkers are removed, we can find a continuity. We can find that the same forces animate both these forms of life that we are surrounded by, as well as human beings. So this very beautiful expression, which I want to read out again and reflect on a little bit, connects the trees or plants again, which, if you recall, was something that we saw in the first description of Robin Watt herself. And here again, we see the same thing. There is radical potential in forms of life that appear to humans, and this is a very limited anthropocentric view. In this limited view, trees appear stationary and passive. And it is the radical potential in what appears passive and stationary that the narrator activates. The narrator activates that radical potential and finds a way to perceive human beings as having that radical potential. Ultimately, what this radical potential means is the ability to forge connections beyond biological limits. Traditionally, it is assumed that human beings need to connect with each other, need to have relationships with each other in order to prolong the human race, in order to survive, that is. And that leads to this idea of heteronormative, solely heteronormative ways of reproduction. Scholars of queer studies have challenged this for a long time, Most famously, Edelman writes about no future. And recently, there are other scholarly approaches, and there are ways of thinking about ecology and reproduction that do not subscribe to heteronormative rules. And here we can see again a magically prescient voice in this novel Nightwood, which creates ways of relating between human beings that bypass these heteronormative and biological ways of reproduction. But theory aside, the sentence itself is quite arresting, and I just want to read it again. The design that was to be the weather-beaten grain of her face. So first, the narrator tells us that although she had the face and the skin of a child, that is, and here the assumption is that children's skin is not as wrinkly. It is clear and it's tight and doesn't have the kind of textures, that is the wrinkles or the folds that people's skin tends to have as they grow older. But this childlike skin also reveals, or the languages could be seen coming. There's a childlike skin, but within this childlike skin, one can see coming or anticipate coming the weather-beaten grain of her face. And it's not just that she would eventually grow old like everyone else, but there is something about the manner in which she is anticipating old age, which reminds the narrator, or which evokes for the narrator, this expression that wood in the work, the tree coming forward in her, an undocumented record of time. This last phrase, an undocumented record of time, is an extremely complicated and ambiguous use of language. There is wordplay here. Record of time, this refers to trees and the common idea in science that one can estimate or guess the age of a tree by looking at different cross sections of the bark. Time passes and leaves its record, whether or not people care to see it or understand it. This is the record of time. And then undocumented refers to the way nature ages. Human beings are not very sensitive to these passages and scales of the evolution of the world. And therefore, again, here in this perspective, in this moment, the narrator is inviting the reader to expand their moral compass and to broaden their material imagination, to think that while they are visualizing the face of this woman Nora, they can see something about the way trees and plants age. Now, Nora, we are told, has a very strange sort of face, and ultimately what we are expected to understand is that there is something in Nora which registers the many exclusions, the many alienations that human beings in modern Europe have to live with. But there is something in Nora's existence which cannot be reduced to simply being a function of those alienations. I will stop this lecture here and go on to take a few minutes from the next lecture to wrap up our discussion of Nightwood and move on to the next novel and novelist, which is going to be Zora Neale Hurston, and the book that we will talk about is Their Eyes Were Watching God. Thank you.